This is the story of camouflage. Inspired by nature, designed by artists, used by the military.
In nature, there's an obvious need for camouflage. You're either a hunter or hunted.
Humans learned that by copying nature, we too could escape our enemies. But global warfare called for something more. With a surge of ingenuity, camouflage was born. The secret weapons in this story are artists who have used their creative genius to dupe, confuse, and outsmart the enemy.
I don't think you could design camouflage unless you had a creative mind.
As art movements developed, so too did camouflage, one fueling the other. But as war became more sophisticated, camouflage artists would struggle to be heard. Now, as war, art and technology collide, the question is, who's in charge of camouflage? The story of camouflage begins in the 19th century with an eccentric American painter named Abbot Thayer.
Abbot Thayer's one of my heroes, the father of camouflage. And as an artist and a natural historian, he was the person that first documented the varying techniques by which nature employs camouflage.
He painted rather conventional portraits of women, generally. That was what he did for his main trade. But as a naturalist, he was fascinated by camouflage in the natural world, in fact, obsessed.
Thayer noted how some animals had spots, speckles and stripes, while others were coloured and shaded. He saw how these characteristics helped them evade predators, blend into the background, and escape being eaten.
He believed every creature that exists is camouflage, even the brightest ones. And he set out to paint pictures of these creatures to prove it.
Thayer thought that the research of camouflage would be of value to everyone and to society, I think, and especially in wartime. But he thought that the only people who were truly capable of investigating it in a genuine, practical way were artists.
This is a painting of a copperhead snake. Initially, you don't see it, but Thayer came up with this clever device of overlaying it with a stencil. Voila, there is the snake.
Thayer was onto something big, and he knew it.
There was suddenly the possibility of using what he had discovered for wartime purposes.
But Thayer was ahead of his time. In the late 1800s, soldiers weren't trying to hide from the enemy. They wanted to be seen.
The British Army particularly, they used to wear bright red tunics. The idea is that you show you're powerful. That way, you put fear into the opponent.
The colour of your coat also showed whose side you were on.
So it was important to have high visibility because gunfire, the smoke was so thick, they might end up attacking the wrong member or maybe even going in the wrong direction.
But when machine guns replaced muskets, the Brits' brightly coloured tunics became a liability.
Quickly, all the red coats were thrown in the dirt or into tea and mud in order to make soldiers less of an obvious target.
The army moved away from their red uniforms to what they called drab, to uniforms that apparently would vanish into the background, and it worked.
That wasn't enough for the eccentric artist Abbot Thayer.
Thayer had even gone as far as suggesting to the British Army in 1914 that they forgo their khaki uniforms and actually adopt a uniform made up of different colours.
Thayer had sewn scraps of cloth to an old hunting jacket, possibly the world's first camouflage coat. But he wasn't a military man, and he was difficult, moody, argumentative. This put the military off.
I think Thayer was always getting in trouble because he was an artist, not a scientist, and his tone of voice was very combative, and it was very easy to see it as being arrogant. And I think today, we would say he was probably manic depressive in a pretty severe way.
So the army politely dismissed Thayer's camouflage coat as impractical. World War I was a game-changer. Machine guns, tanks and aeroplanes wreaked carnage on the battlefield. Death and destruction on a scale unknown in human history. To survive, soldiers would have to get better at hiding from enemy fire. New skills were desperately needed, and it was the French who led the way.
The French were the first to come up with a camouflage unit. They were the most organised, partly because they had a huge stretch of the front line to look after, hundreds of miles long.
The French military enlisted scores of artists, sculptors and decorators to help them hide soldiers and artillery on the battlefields. They called them camoufleurs, from the French verb to dress up, disguise or conceal.
So the first thing that they did is that the French developed hooded outfits. Cagoules is what they called them, and they were rather sinister. And they were paint streaked to make them less visible.
The Section de Camouflage was made an official war unit, the first of its kind in any army in the world. Throughout World War I, the French would recruit almost 3,000 artists.
Before the industrial print process had been developed, the only way in which they could get camouflage onto artillery, onto tanks and guns and buildings, the only way to do it was to hand paint it. And so they needed an awful lot of artists.
It wasn't long before other countries set up their own camouflage units. There was no end to the weird and wonderful ways artists used their skills to create all sorts of trickery. They made fake heads to draw enemy fire. Threw netting over vehicles and gun emplacements to conceal them with shadows. And because dead horses were a common sight on World War I battlefields, they made papier-mâché replicas for snipers to hide inside.
And then you could actually have a peephole that you looked through. You could observe what was going on. You could actually use that as a sniper post. That was a little dangerous.
For many artists, camouflage work was a refuge from war itself.
I think it's true to say that artists, they're often sensitive people, and they're probably the last that want to enter into any armed conflict. So it was kind of convenient that any artist would be sent to a camouflage regiment and would simply have to paint rather than go to wars.
The story of the creation of modern camouflage cannot be told without its rebellious cousin, Cubism, a radical new movement that revolutionised 20th century art.
Camouflage would never have existed without the Cubist art movement. It was only after the emergence of Cubism that artists were able to see a way in which they could create an abstract rendition of nature.
Cubism was born in France in 1907, a reaction to tired art traditions of old. Cubist pioneers Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso broke up subjects into geometric shapes. They developed new ways of seeing, unconventional and abstract, to reflect a new age in the 20th century.
Really, it broke apart traditional understanding of natural form, a new form of art that celebrated modernity, speed, innovations, mechanizations and science and all those things that made up this new dynamic modern world.
As Cubists played with form and shape on canvas, camoufleurs brought a creative eye to the battlefield. One inevitably influenced the other.
There seems to be an obvious link between the Cubist way of distorting space, of presenting many, many views at the same time, and camouflage. It's the most amazing fusion between warfare, creativity, art and industry.
Pablo Picasso, although not a camouflage artist, happily took credit for its creation.
In 1914, Picasso and Gertrude Stein in Paris saw a camouflage tank. And Picasso was ecstatic. He said, you know, that is Cubism, we did it.
As World War I dragged on in the trenches, the British had new problems at sea.
In 1917, as many as 55 British ships were sunk by submarines in 1 week. And it became apparent that if something was not done about this, very likely the Germans were going to win the war.
It was very important the British developed some form of system to protect shipping from this highly developed submarine warfare. And so there were many people who were looking at how to disguise shipping, how to make it less visible.
Abbot Thayer was among them. In his usual overzealous way, he came up with all sorts of ideas for camouflaging ships. But not being a man of the sea, some were wildly outlandish.
He tried to use a sheet that was supposed to look like a cloud or something floating over the ship. It just fell apart because he didn't know anything about the structure of ships.
Thayer badgered navies on both sides of the Atlantic to paint their ships in varying shades of black, grey and white to make them harder to see.
He went to Washington, D.C. and proposed that they shouldn't be one color, and that in fact they were more vulnerable because of being one color.
By now, Abbot Thayer was considered a crackpot, and this time his ideas were not only dismissed, he was trumped by another artist.
Norman Wilkinson came up with an idea in which he said, wait a minute, the problem is not to hide a ship. You can't hide a ship. It has smoke coming out of its smokestacks. The real problem is, how can you make it hard to hit?
My grandfather's scheme differed in that he wasn't trying to conceal the ship. He was trying to create an illusion that it was taking a different course.
Norman Wilkinson was a respected artist and wartime naval officer. He suggested painting the sides of ships in bold stripes and cubist-like patterns to confuse enemy submarines. He called his scheme Dazzle.
If you have stripes, the human eye can't fix on the stripes. So the pattern distorts the perception of the direction the ship is going in. If the ship is travelling in this direction, in reality, the U-boat captain, his aim is to hit the centre of the ship. However, if he believes the ship is travelling in this direction, the torpedo may just pass by. Because torpedoes were very expensive, unless they were really confident that they were going to sink the ship, they wouldn't fire the torpedo.
Norman Wilkinson brought what was a highly innovative but very cheap way of trying to combat the U-boat threat in the First World War. Really, all it cost was the paint that would paint the ships, basically.
Camouflage artists were using the sides of the ships as huge canvases.
To test the patterns, they made models of the ships, painted them with Dazzle designs, and placed them on a turntable.
In one of these demonstrations, some American admiral looked at it, and he didn't really like the look of these Dazzle ships. And he got the range wrong, he got it all wrong, but he said, how the hell do you expect me to know which way the ship is going when it's dressed up in all that fancy colour? Which was the whole point of the exercise.
There were empirical laboratory experiments in 1919, this is at the end of the war, and they show that sometimes the calculations could be deceived so substantially that they might be off as much as 56 degrees. That's amazing.
More than 5,000 ships on both sides of the Atlantic got the Dazzle treatment in World War I.
The British public and the American public, they simply fell in love with Dazzle. Anybody could just walk out to the harbors and they could see these massive, gaudy, painted circus-like ships. People called it a futurist bad dream or a cubist nightmare.
Somehow, Wilkinson, an old-fashioned painter of ships, had led the Navy into the modernist art movement.
I would love to have seen a Dazzle ship. I'd love to have seen how the sheer scale of a destroyer painted in stripes in these remarkable, ridiculous diagonal patterns would have disrupted this vast canvas. They were effective. At the heart of it, though, the Royal Navy loathed the idea that they could turn their wonderful, massive vehicles of destruction and defense into something that looked like modern painting. But goodness me, they caught the imagination.
Wilkinson was hailed a hero, and given the size of his canvases, it could be argued Dazzle ships were among the most dramatically successful artworks of the period.
Wilkinson was given a financial reward for his work in the war. Thayer was left a very embittered man because he tried to persuade the American authorities to adopt these ideas with no success. Thayer died soon after the war, a totally broken man.
The First World War left 17 million dead. The scale of destruction, the horror of trench warfare, blasted bodies strewn on the battlefields. all left deep scars. The art world reacted with surrealism.
The whole idea of illusion and a world in which you couldn't trust your own perceptions, that's the key to surrealism, and it's the key also to the kind of warfare fought through camouflage that emerged in the Second World War. So the connection is very, very tight.
As the surrealists stretched and distorted fall, all too soon another war loomed. One that would wreak even more carnage, this time from above. By the mid-1930s, dramatic advances in aircraft design brought a terrifying new threat from the skies. Warplanes capable of flying massive bombing missions.
Well, the aerial eye sort of makes everyone paranoid because it's the all-seeing eye from above, and it's a perspective on your lives that wasn't usual.
In 1937, Guernica in Spain was razed to the ground in the world's first full-scale aerial attack of a town. It was a horrifying portent of things to come.
Picasso was very finely attuned to what was happening in the politics of the Mediterranean area, and after the bombing of that small village, made this most extraordinary painting. A real cri de coeur. A heartfelt kind of sob about what had happened to these defenseless children and their families. It's possibly, in the whole of the 20th century, the most powerful vision of atrocity ever painted.
Within 10 months, more than 50,000 bombs fell on London, and this doesn't take into account the thousands of incendiaries dropped in night raids.
When World War II broke out in 1939, it erupted from the skies. There was nowhere to hide. Camouflage artists were needed more than ever.
The challenge this time was far more difficult because they had to camouflage huge areas from aerial view, and they employed a whole series of new techniques to achieve that.
More than paints and brushes would be needed this time. As well as artists, scores of architects, engineers, and set designers were recruited.
The Second World War was a truly global war, and threat and violence came from every quarter. And so camouflage had to scale up in a way that had never been seen before.
Now, this little shed wouldn't bother anyone, or would it?
Every fighting army created a very significant team of camoufleurs.
Camoufleurs had to be more inventive to deceive and defeat the enemy. The ever-present threat of being bombed from the air meant their work had to be three-dimensional, grand in vision and scope.
They were employed in various ways, sometimes to conceal potential targets like munitions factories and so on, railway lines, and sometimes to create fake versions of those in other places to divert the attack.
It was large-scale trickery. The architects and engineers built entire fake towns and villages,
They had an understanding of scale, they had an understanding of the texture of buildings and landscapes, so they were able to generate illusions.
The quaint Belgian village is as phony as Hitler's handshake.
Hamburg was under constant attack. So, in an amazing feat of deception, the Germans built a replica of the city over the River Elbe, successfully diverting enemy bombers.
The river was covered with wooden structures. Everything was painted in order to give the illusion of a sort of continuous extension of the city over what was, in fact, an expanse of water.
In the US, in some cases, aircraft factories were completely concealed by overhanging, phony suburban neighborhoods with little ticky-tacky houses with clothing on the clothesline and maybe a few housewives out there. I hope they weren't made of papier-mâché.
Hastily assembled using netting and plywood, the rooftop of this bomber factory in Seattle hid 7,000 B-17 bombers. Even Australia had its own crew of camoufleurs in World War II, who also achieved amazing feats. Artists hid Bankstown Aerodrome outside Sydney, disguising the runways with papier-mâché cows. The hangars made to look like shops, so from above, it looked like a sleepy country town.
The idea that artists would come in and give advice would have seemed laughable to a lot of military people because art was not taken seriously in Australia.
Undaunted, the group's leader, zoologist Professor William Dakin, recruited over 100 talented Australian painters, photographers and designers. Among them, painter and sculptor Frank Hinder, considered one of Australia's finest camoufleurs.
Frank Hinder was a cutting-edge abstractionist at a time where, in Australia, abstraction was considered a kind of madness. People didn't really understand this ultra-modern art. And he brought his skills, which were graphic design as well as abstraction, to the kinds of projects that the artists were involved with in camouflage.
Up-and-coming photographer Max Dupain would become the group's star recruit. He'd gained notoriety experimenting with nets over nude models.
The surrealist aspect of his photography, I think, had an interesting application in war itself. He'd use the netting like a camouflage artist to break up the contours of the body and make them difficult to read. And in that sense, he was working in an area that an artist would call abstraction, but a camouflage artist would call disruptive patterning.
Dupain knew all about the tricks of shadow and put this knowledge to good use in the theatre of war.
Remember that shadow. It's just as important as the object itself. It can give away your whole installation if you don't keep it broken up. There now. See what you get? Would you ever guess there was a plane down there?
Despite their successes, Australian camoufleurs were treated with contempt. They were civilians. They didn't belong to a unit. They didn't even have a uniform, and their title didn't help.
Since the First World War, the term camoufleur was used for anyone who did camouflage. That's because it came from France. The whole idea of a camoufleur being floral and florid and passive made their jobs so much harder. Frank joked about himself and his fellow camoufleurs as camo pansies. Such was the sort of fear of the effeminate connection between the name of their job from a military point of view.
Elsewhere in the war, camouflage artists were mocked and derided too. When British tanks arrived in the Western Desert in 1941, they were anything but camouflaged.
They actually arrived in the desert with tanks with the green and brown lozenges on, and someone said, excuse me, hold on, it's all sand here. These things aren't going to be camouflaged against anything.
The need for deception and concealment in the desert led to all sorts of amazing inventions.
When this framework is covered with cloth and painted in appropriate colors, it is mounted on a quarter-ton truck and will appear as a light tank at 1,000 yards.
The British even enlisted a magician who fronted a group called the Magic Gang to lure German bombers to a fake harbour in the desert. The Americans took deception to the extreme with a top-secret unit called the Ghost Army. Recruited from art schools and advertising agencies, the job of the Ghost Army was to scare and confuse the enemy by creating fake battalions in phony camps, fake battles, fake anything, really.
A dummy turret, which on a real tank would weigh several tons, comes off with ease. But the decoy armor fooled the German air reconnaissance during the war. Did you ever see a tank walking? Well, it's easy if you pick the right tank.
There was an attempt to be more diverse in coming up with ways of deceiving the other side. And in some cases, it would distract them. In some cases, it would make them waste their energy and efforts on targets or seeming spurious events that actually didn't exist.
These wacky schemes even involved elaborate soundscapes.
Mounted in this vehicle, 800 pounds of sonic equipment can simulate hundreds of tons of armored vehicles. This one projected the sound of tanks going up. This one projected tanks going down. And he reported that the column had turned off the main road onto the river road.
Camouflaged uniforms appeared on the battlefield for the first time during World War II. And it was the fashion-conscious Italians who led the way.
The Italians were the first to come up with an industrial printing process that allowed for cost-efficient mass production of printed cloth. Until then, it was really very specialist elite forces that had hand-painted camouflage uniforms, snipers and other specialists.
The Italians had developed the first pattern, telomimetico, which literally translates as camouflage cloth. But it was the Germans who first issued them to every soldier in World War II.
When camouflage patterns first started to develop, to the untrained eye, they kind of all looked the same, which had some devastating effects. There were lots of cases of Americans jumping out of planes, parachuting down to the field and getting shot down by British soldiers who assumed that they must be Germans because they're wearing camouflage.
Despite these early calamities, the uniforms would have made Abbot Thayer, the father of modern camouflage, proud.
When camouflage uniforms are not available, they must be toned down. This is done by the application of dye or burlap garland strips.
But a uniform wasn't enough. By 1942, Australians were fighting the Japanese in the Southwest Pacific. But Australia's military leaders failed to back William Dakin and his team of camoufleurs.
Dakin had two problems. One was convincing people that it wasn't effeminate to hide, and secondly, convincing people that it was good to try and empathise with the thinking of an animal in the jungle. And he said to them, you've got to get down on your bellies and crawl like a snake. It was a kind of animal masculinity that he was after, a kind of primitive masculinity. But a lot of the troops over there found this dehumanising. There was this struggle to get people to accept the idea that deception is part of warfare. And it was a schizophrenic kind of thing because society in the everyday did not condone deception, but the same society in war was promoting deception.
Pearl Harbor garrison reported an armada of planes approaching.
In December 1941, the unthinkable happened. The Japanese attacked a US naval base on American soil. It was a critical turning point and moved the war perilously close to Australia. William Dakin's urgent appeal to send a team north to camouflage Australia's top end was ignored.
He was now the technical director of camouflage for the whole of the Australian region, yet he wasn't taken seriously. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the camouflage team took the initiative to go up there and to suss out what the vulnerabilities of Darwin were.
Finally, a steamship loaded with tons of camouflage materials sailed north. But it was already too late. The Japanese had been planning an attack on Darwin for months. "235 people were killed and 400 wounded, 30 aircraft destroyed and 8 ships sunk. It was Australia's deadliest attack. According to William Dakin, it was a disaster that should never have happened.
Well, Dakin was quite an explosive and expressive man, and he didn't hold back on blaming the Army and the Navy publicly in the newspaper. He believed that the destruction in Darwin could have been lessened considerably if the military had taken camouflage seriously.
The end of World War II spelled the end of an era for camouflage artists who returned to their studios, picking up where they'd left off as best they could.
After the 6 years of global catastrophe, how were artists meant to respond? How could anyone write poetry after Auschwitz? So that existential crisis about what it was to be a creative individual was catastrophic in many ways for artists. It sent many of them into producing work that was bleak and a continuation, in many ways, of the violence that many of them had been surrounded by in the war.
After the Second World War, the military had turned its back on artists and seized control of camouflage. Paints and brushes, decoys and dummy tanks were no match for radar, sonar and infrared surveillance. rampant new technology was again changing war.
Painters had no part to play in that, and that brought scientists and designers into a new interface to create the most amazing innovations.
Science and technology were now leading the charge in modern warfare. Camouflage, now in the hands of military scientists, underwent a metamorphosis. Organic rounded shapes gave way to small pixelated squares.
I run into the observation a lot that camouflage is not rocket science, that anybody can figure out if camouflage looks good or it's going to work. That's not true. It's a combination of psychophysics, biophysics, optics. If you just scratch something out on a piece of paper, like a fashion designer, it's probably not going to work.
Each new conflict produced innovations in concealment and deception. There was just no room for art in these high-tech combat zones. So, whatever happened to the artists kicked out of camouflage work after World War II? The answer lies back in the swinging 60s. Amid the massive social and political upheaval of the times, artists fired the first shots in a counter-offensive to reclaim camouflage for their art. Italy's Alighiero Boetti framed a piece of the world's first camouflage cloth, Tello Mimetico, raising a middle finger to the Italian army.
And it only took one step for an artist to put it inside a frame and say, this may once have been utilitarian, it may once have been used to hide somebody from violence, but look at it now, it has its own aesthetic property, enjoy it for what it is.
American pop artist Andy Warhol went one step further.
And he decided to take the American woodland pattern, adapted the scale of the pattern and changed the colours into some more crazy poppy kind of colours.
Fashion joined the fray, and by the 1990s, army surplus had gone from the street to the catwalk.
I guess I'm a camoufleur and a purveyor of camouflage with a very solid intention to change the symbolic value of camouflage and make people understand that it is very much in the domain of natural historians and artists, and it's not the property of the military.
With the floodgates open, many artists reappropriated camouflage, elevating it to high art. Having reclaimed their creation, artists even began camouflaging themselves. Chinese artist Lu Bolin is the invisible man. He paints himself into the background, but is not completely unseen.
first impression, Lou Bollin's work is about being hidden away, and yet it says several things at many layers. It's very clever. It's about the invisibility of artists in society, and it's also about the loss of individuality of many of us. How do we make sure we don't just vanish into the background? So it's a form of camouflage, but it's a kind of social camouflage.
Today, as 21st century fears about terrorism and the enemy within reach fever pitch, the race is on to develop new forms of camouflage. Adam Harvey is a rebel artist, trying to hide in a world of intense surveillance. He uses computer technology in his work to outsmart face recognition software.
The face is becoming used more as a fingerprint in public, and it's not a great idea to walk around showing everybody a unique identifier that can be used to network pieces of data about you.
In his latest foray, Adam Harvey is trying to outwit infrared and thermal imaging detection systems with a camouflage cloak, a futuristic French cagoule perhaps.
I did some research, figured out that there were these metal-plated fabrics that would provide a thermal barrier. And then I worked with a fashion designer here in New York City to design garments that would, showcase the technology in a conceptual way. So anything that's underneath it is going to be hidden because your body heat is now reflected by that metal-plated fabric.
Adam Harvey has a rival in the race for cutting-edge camouflage. Guy Kramer has become one of the world's top designers of military camouflage.
I can't draw a stick man worth of beans, but I can design camouflage on a computer with a series of graphic equations and programs and brush tools and whatnot without any issues.
An ex-paintball champion, Kramer was an unlikely hero. Unimpressed with the available camo, he set out to beat the army at its own game.
I put something up on the internet saying, see what I can do with a $100 graphics program in 2 hours of work. And the King of Jordan had his cousin call me up and say, can you design for us? Thus started my career, and 4 million uniforms later, here we are.
Love this pattern.
That's good.
That's the bit.
More than 1 million soldiers in a dozen countries wear Guy Kramer's camouflage. He's developed 12,000 patterns using mathematical algorithms. A modern-day Abbot Thayer. He's bridging the divide between science and art.
Being a camoufleur is an artistic process where you're using artistic techniques to achieve what they were doing in World War I and World War II. And so no longer is it a subjective art form. It is something that is heavily based on science. But the artistic side of it is a critical aspect, because if you don't have an aesthetically pleasing camouflage, the end user isn't going to want to wear it. Kind of like the Maxwell Smart.
Guy Kramer is also chasing the ultimate in camouflage, invisibility.
We've actually come up with the technology you see in the Predator movies, or the Harry Potter cloak everyone keeps talking about.
With what he calls a quantum stealth cloak, he claims he can make a person disappear.
Let me just close a few programs here I don't want you seeing.
That includes me.
But there's just one problem. It's so top secret, no one is allowed to see it.
This machine utilizes X-ray, ultraviolet, and alpha, beta, and omega rays.
We were looking at what was being done with light and light particles and light waves, and accidentally come onto this material. I was actually able to make our cat disappear. And then we scaled it up and actually made a person disappear.
Into Army-guarded secret government vaults he goes.
I have seen it, but I can't discuss it.
Really, the idea of an invisibility cloak is impossible.
To my critics that think that we haven't actually come up with anything, that we're just blowing smoke, it is coming, and it is coming big time.
So, has the story of camouflage, the unique collaboration between nature, artists, and the military, come full circle?
It doesn't matter how much science falls into it. At the end of the day, it is still an art form.
You can invent drones. You can invent invisible cloaks. You can just go on and invent things as long as you want.
As soon as we develop a new, highly effective form of camouflage, whatever the technology, then it's not going to be very much after that. We will have to move on and develop another one. And it doesn't seem to be a process that will ever end.
Technology is accelerating at such a rapid rate. Maybe by the time that technology is ready, we'll have figured out a way not to go to war at all.